Welcome to Free Kiwis, episode 12. We're honoured today to be joined by Chris Trotter, who has been a political commentator, editor and writer in New Zealand for decades. And I've been reading his columns for, a good 15 years at least, and have always found them most thought-provoking. And now, Chris, you are a member also of the Free Speech Coalition, is that right?
I am indeed, although I believe it is now properly referred to as the Free Speech Union. I believe they've completed all the necessary formalities and have now taken on that identity. So we shall see whether they have the success of the Free Speech Union in the United Kingdom.
Indeed.
Which they have modelled themselves.
Well, that's good to know. In fact, James and I are also members, and I hadn't actually caught up on the fact that transition had been completed. So I'm delighted to hear it, and like you, I do hope that they enjoy similar success. It seems to me quite a good way ahead in terms of protecting people's democratic rights when we're faced with potential encroachment on those rights from various sources. And in fact, that could be a very good place to start. And I'd like to refer actually to an article you've recently published in Bow Alley Road about free speech and potential encroachment on it. And in that article, you interestingly visit the Weimar Republic in 1920s Germany and the Nazi publication Der Stürmer, whose editor was Julius Streicher, and you point out that he was tolerated under the Weimar Republic, with free speech being very much a founding principle of that republic, and then later condemned at Nuremberg. And the principle at Nuremberg seemed to be that hate speech leads to hate crime. And you go on in that article to ask whether New Zealand is in a similar place to 1920s Germany and conclude, I think rightly, that it's not. But what I'm interested in from that is where we might consider hate speech laws to have a place. Correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the things that I inferred from that article was that you might see a place for hate speech laws if there were extremist elements that could be incited to hate crime as a result. Is that an accurate reading?
Yes, I have to confess that studying the history of the Weimar Republic does give you pause in relation to this whole issue, because there is no doubt that Der Stürmer was a virulently anti-Semitic publication, which openly called for the murder of the Jewish people. Mm. And it was published, I think, from the early 1920s right up until the collapse of the Third Reich. It wasn't, incidentally, a Nazi publication. The Nazi newspaper was called the Völkische Beobachter, and they like to think it had a slightly higher tone than Der Stürmer. Streicher was funded by extreme nationalists, or one particular extreme nationalist. But Hitler was always very protective of Streicher. He liked the down in the gutter style of Streicher's anti-Semitism, and although Goebbels and Goering attempted to prevail upon him to rein in Der Stürmer, he always threw the cloak of his protection over it and over Streicher. And certainly the judges at Nuremberg were quite happy to draw the direct link between the anti-Semitic hatred and, more than hatred, the open counselling of what amounted to genocide.
I see. So perhaps
Stryker engaged in. And if that is the measure of hate speech, then you'll get no argument from me. Because even as we speak, our laws prohibit precisely the sort of speech that Stryker and the Stürmer specialized in, which is incitement to cause direct and possibly or definitely fatal harm to a group purely on the basis of their ethnicity, religion. Although, of course, the Nazis always defined Jewishness in terms of race, never in terms of religious belief, which is very strange, given that Judaism is most emphatically a religion.
Well, you might
embraced by people of a great many races.
You might be drawing the line there in the same place as Karl Popper, who we've discussed a few times on this podcast, and he talked about intolerance, where we draw the line with intolerance, and it seems to be the case in his writings that he draws the line at violence or possibly incitement to violence. And of course, he was one of the people, he was Jewish, he was living in Vienna at the time. He was one of the people that publications like Der Stürmer were taking aim at. So it's interesting to see that he put the line there, but he didn't necessarily want to go further. In fact, he defended people's right to express ideas, even ideas that we find offensive.
Yes, although the opponents of free speech often seize upon Popper as a philosopher who essentially agrees with them that we must be intolerant of intolerance. But yeah, I'm glad to hear you offer a measure of defense for Popper there, because I think it's reasonably straightforward in terms of the free speech debate, where you draw the line. And the line is drawn here in New Zealand and in most jurisdictions against direct incitement to inflict harm, destruction, or death upon the persons or property of another citizen or any human being for that matter.
Yes, it seems to me that that's very similar, in fact, to simple incitement to violence.
Yes.
Although it's writ large, and it's to do with an entire category of people rather than perhaps an individual. And so I think, I wasn't actually that aware of the kinds of things that Der Stürmer promulgated, but I think I probably agree with you. If they were openly calling for extermination, then that is probably beyond the pale. But to bring it back to Popper for a minute there, it raises this his term, the paradox of tolerance, which is something James and I have discussed with others on this podcast a number of times. And James, it's a little bit ambiguous, isn't it, what his actual view was? You had that work that seemed to suggest that he wanted to rule out any kind of anti-democratic or any kind of argument that might undermine the tolerance of a democratic society?
Yeah, well, so the problem is with this is that Popper, I think, didn't really build up this theory of the paradox of intolerance. He only mentions it twice, as far as I can say, in his writings, which are voluminous. One of them is in a footnote or an endnote to Volume 1 of The Open Society and Its Enemies. And in that, it's very clear that he's only talking about people who want to use their fists or pistols, as he says. So that's people who used violence in response to argument. There's a later lecture on The Open Society given in 1962 where he seems to take a slightly stronger stance against people who, as you say, Michael, are sort of against democracy and liberalism in general. But he's certainly not saying, Chris is right that, there's a cartoon that circulates on the internet where he's taken as saying, anyone who's intolerant just in any way that we want to define it, that anyone like that has to be shut down. That's definitely not what he's saying. He's putting the bar much higher than that.
Yeah. I mean, the thing about Julius Streicher and Sturmer, Streicher was a deeply disturbed individual, and the newspaper itself was notorious, not only for its anti-Semitism, but its nearly pornographic obsession with Jewish men and flaxen-haired German maidens. And it was taken to court. Streicher himself, too, I believe, was prosecuted a number of times, but under the German libel laws, because he was quite content, as many extremist bloggers are today, to aim people, professionals and business owners, and call openly, for their businesses to be boycotted, or he simply told the most astonishing lies about them, and he was taken to court, but he was taken to court under the libel laws. He couldn't be taken to court in a Popperian sense, because the Weimar Constitution, which was the most progressive of its day, guaranteed Germans the right to freedom of expression in relation to just about all things. And the Weimar Republic is a very interesting period of history to study, because in many ways it anticipates the what they call the cultural revolution, or the countercultural revolution of the 1960s and 70s. And it's interesting that some of the very same people who were intellectually active in the Weimar Republic as very young people, like the psychologist and sociologist Erich Fromm. He was a young man in Weimar, but in the 1960s, his books like Fear of Freedom were read by the counterculture with great avidity, and the reaction to the counterculture in the United States, interestingly, is almost identical in terms of the American right as the reaction to the freedoms made possible under Weimar from the German right. It's a very interesting dynamic that you see in play there.
It occurred to me when I was in Berlin, actually, in the German History Museum, reading about that period of history, that in many ways Weimar seemed to be doomed from the outset. It was, of course, not rooted in a culture that had any history of democracy, and so there was no kind of cultural soil in which that kind of progressive constitution could thrive. And
that's a reassuring thought, but I would dispute that. At the outbreak of World War I, for example, more German men had the vote than British men did.
That's interesting. Yeah,
and you could argue that the Reichstag, while it elected people and it had budgets passed or not passed, and it did a lot of the same sorts of things that the British House of Commons did. The only real difference was that the British monarchy was emphatically a constitutional one, whereas the German monarchy actually had more or less the powers of an American president. It's very interesting because the Kaiser could appoint his chancellor, and the Kaiser had a great deal of control over foreign policy, very similar in many respects to the sort of powers wielded by an American president.
I see. That's interesting.
And of course, it had the largest left-wing party in the world at the time, the Social Democratic Party, and it also had one of the strongest trade union movements in the world also. So, Germany was at least as democratic as the United States in 1914, and probably more democratic than the British system. Not least because, of course, notwithstanding the Liberal Party's reforms, the House of Lords still stood athwart a great many progressive changes and required a huge effort on the part of the House of Commons to overrule.
Yeah. It's interesting. The history of democratic institutions I find fascinating. And you're right, of course, that it's easy to forget that universal suffrage is very young in most parts of the world. But one thing
that democracy is one of the oldest on earth.
Indeed, that's right.
Democracy, and it has been one in which universal suffrage has been present since 1893. You've got to look long and hard to find
anything older.
Longer.
With that having been said, it does strike me that although Britain was not early to introduce universal suffrage, what it did have was basically 1,000 years of gradual erosion of the power of the monarchy and movement towards liberalism. And it's interesting for me, at any rate, to contrast that with other countries in Europe that had a much more rapid transition from a totalitarian monarchy to something democratic. The French, of course, had their revolution in the 18th century that was very violent, and then Germany had its ructions with of course it came together as an agglomeration of quasi-independent principalities into the federation, and then the most striking of all would be Russia, that went almost overnight from an absolute monarchy to a Soviet communist dictatorship. So perhaps that gradual evolution could be seen as something that mitigates the propensity to.
You are a Whig, sir. You are a Whig.
I'm afraid I am.
You are a Whig,
an unabashed one. Yes,
an unabashed one, and some who are not Whigs might point out that the behaviour of the British government immediately prior to the outbreak of war in 1914, with the Cat and Mouse Act, the forced feeding of suffragettes, the Carrara Mutiny, the dramatic rise of the trade unions and the disruption they were causing, pointed to a less than Whiggish, let alone stable British system, but that's an argument for another day.
I'm certainly not denying their imperialism, but what I am suggesting is that gradual evolution gave democracy deeper roots when it eventuated. That's my argument. I'm certainly not saying that they were some kind of pristine or humanitarian.
Gradual is an interesting word. You realise, of course, that per capita more people died during the English Civil War, or as Christopher Hill would call it, the English Revolution, than died in World War One.
Yes, it was certainly a bloody period. Yeah. So one might be reminded as well of Ira Glasser of the American Civil Liberties Union, who defended the right of Nazis to march in Illinois in the 1970s, I think it was. So if we compare that with, Weimar Germany, or the
the United States is second to none in terms of its defence of freedom of expression. I mean, the First Amendment really makes it almost impossible for politicians in particular, or public figures of any kind really, to mount a successful case for libel or for defamation. The various cases over the years, most famously the one between the editor of, I think it was Hustler and Jerry Falwell. That was the I think the Supreme Court decision, which effectively stripped away the protection of the defamation laws from any public figure in the United States, purely on the basis of that First Amendment right.
Although it hasn't always been the case that the First Amendment has been very well upheld, is it? I mean,
no, that's true. You go back to Woodrow Wilson and
yes.
World War One, and the abrogation of First Amendment rights was appalling.
Not to mention the McCarthyist period of the 50s.
Yes, that's true. Although, I'm not sure whether that was a freedom of expression debate.
Well, if you tried to freely express communist ideas at the time, you would have.
In quite the same way. It was always couched as a national security question. And that national security question was raised before McCarthy, to be fair to McCarthy, although he certainly jumped on that bandwagon.
But we might see national security as something that's used by people quite often to suppress ideas they don't like.
That's right. And the Espionage Act, which dates all the way back to Woodrow Wilson and the early part of the 20th century, was used repeatedly by Barack Obama against people like Chelsea Manning.
And in some ways, in a smaller way, Jacinda Ardern could be seen to be doing that now with the presently proposed hate speech legislation here. If you consider that her impetus was Brenton Tarrant's murderous rampage, and the idea that could somehow have been prevented had we had appropriate hate speech laws.
Oh yes, there's no doubt about it. The Christchurch mosque shootings have been seized upon and used quite shamelessly, in my opinion, by those who have a certain agenda on these issues, shall we say. Without the Christchurch mosque shooting, I doubt if hate speech would have a very high profile at all in terms of New Zealand politics.
Do you think it was a pre-existing agenda that was given?
Oh, I think there were elements on the left who, prior to Christchurch, had been talking about hate speech and had used the legislation in the United Kingdom as a model, but they were certainly given a huge push forward by the events of 15th March 2019.
Can I ask a bit more about that? Because you're a man of the left, and one of the issues that we keep coming back to on this podcast is that after McCarthyism in the 60s and 70s, even in the 90s and early 2000s, it was usually the left that was more on the side of free speech. I mean, I think in general there was a sort of social contract that both on the left and the right, free speech would be defended. But you go to the Bush years and various other moments in history. Of course, in the McCarthy era, it was more the right that was tempted to sort of quash free speech. In the 90s, I think it was more the sort of religious right, putting labels on CDs and things like this. And nowadays, it strikes us both that it's overwhelmingly this left, and maybe not the old left, but this particular woke left, for lack of a better word. So do you agree with this diagnosis that the left has kind of lost or sort of abandoned free speech? And if so, why do you think that that's happened?
Yes, I think it's undeniable that most of the truly egregious examples in New Zealand have decidedly left-wing flavour. I mean, the banning by Phil Goff, or the attempted banning by Phil Goff of Cheryl Southern and his name, Stephen Molyneux. I think that's where it kicked off. The banning of Don Brash by the Vice Chancellor of Massey University was another notorious case.
Yeah.
And since the 15th of March, the rhetoric has certainly gone up several notches. It's very interesting to try and track back through recent history to the point where the crossover occurred. One of the possible crossover movements came, I think, on the issue of pornography, when the feminist movement, in a sense, joined forces with the Christian right to put an end to pornography, or to further criminalize it in those American states where it was already fairly heftily constrained.
Yeah. Sorry, go on.
So I mean that's one of the earliest examples that I can think of. And I remember at the time thinking, this is really strange. This is very jarring to see these two groups formally at absolute daggers drawn, particularly over the question of abortion. To see these same groups, and often the same women, standing shoulder to shoulder on the pornography question was a very jarring moment in history.
Yeah.
Cogent arguments on both sides, of course, given their ideological positioning, but you don't often see people who you normally saw as bitter opponents suddenly come together on an issue. Although, I suppose if you think of World War II, Winston Churchill shaking the hand of Joseph Stalin is a worthy precedent.
Yeah.
So there we are.
I guess one of the things about that is that perhaps when any movement, be it religious or political, becomes too ideological or too steeped in certainty, perhaps it starts to seek to censor anything that opposes that certainty.
Well, of course, you run into the religious injunction problem, which people like the footballer Folau, I think his name was.
Yeah, that's right.
Who ran into trouble over his statements about gays.
Yep.
You see, if you are a Christian, particularly if you are an evangelical Christian who believes that the Bible is the inerrant word of God, then you have a moral duty to rescue those you see heading towards hell. You should at least try to steer them to the narrower path, as it were.
Yep.
And I think, as you say, with people who have passionately held beliefs, particularly about the nature of society and how it should be organized and what behaviors should be encouraged and what behaviors should not be encouraged, then the same problem that Folau had, becomes your problem. What do you do if you are absolutely set against racism or sexism or homophobia or Islamophobia? What do you do to counter, the evil that you have identified? Surely you must do all within your power, all which the democratic system gives you the power to do. And so you run headlong into all of these philosophical thorn bushes, it seems to me.
It seems to me as well that we could end up with some some strange legal paradoxes if we proceed with the apparently proposed hate speech laws. Then religious vilification is a target, as is, many other identity groups. And what would happen then if Folau was to make those statements and then was targeted and claimed that he was being persecuted for his religious beliefs and expressing his religious ideas, and on the other side you've got him being accused of hate speech against homosexuals.
Exactly. The cynic in me whispers that the elevation of the punishment for hate speech, in inverted commas in this case, and its transfer from, I think it's the Human Rights Act to the Crimes Act, could be an extremely shrewd move on the part of the government, a way of actually having its cake and eating it too, because the moment you make something subject to the punishment of imprisonment for a period not exceeding 3 years, I think it's over 2 years, stand to be corrected on that, a person can elect trial by jury.
Yes.
In fact, that will be the anticipated choice, and I think you have to actually request a judge-only trial. Otherwise, you will be tried by 12 good persons and true. And of course, it seems to me highly unlikely that a New Zealand jury would convict under these proposed laws for anything short of Stürmer.
I see.
Because
yes.
Stürmer is so clearly inciting of hatred and contempt, and as happened in the later years of the newspaper, so openly supportive of wiping out all the Jews of Europe, that it wouldn't take a New Zealand jury more than 2 or 3 hours to convict somebody of publishing or speaking in a public forum words to that effect.
Do we want to take the risk,
anything short of that, I rather suspect that a New Zealand jury would go, nah, that's not hate speech.
Do we want
it's just someone exercising free speech? Get it out of here.
Do we want it to come to court at all, though? I mean, I think it's...
bringing someone to court, arresting someone, charging them, forcing them to go through the system, forcing them to incur the enormous expense, not always recompensed of a legal defence. No, I mean, that is unreasonable. I'm just saying that I would be surprised that if I heard that a New Zealand jury had convicted a fellow New Zealander of hate speech on anything other than the most lurid and indisputable grounds. And the thing is that once that's happened once or twice, the chances of cases being brought, except for the most extreme examples, would, I think, be, the chances would be diminished considerably, because people would realize no jury is going to convict on those sort of hate speech accusations, the one where the person was acquitted and then the other person was acquitted and then the other person was acquitted.
Well,
but you're right. There is an element of persecution in the very fact of being charged and having to stand up in the dock, and all the other things associated with a court case is incredibly stressful, incredibly expensive, and without justification, obvious justification, I think it is a huge imposition.
Not only an
I,
imposition, but something that will have a chilling effect on free expression. I mean, no one wants to go through that. And if you, I mean, even the situation in the UK where they have this, what do they call it, a non-criminal hate incident, or it gets recorded by the police. It seems to me, even without the threat of any kind of legal proceeding, just having a cop turn up on your doorstep and tell you you're on some register is going to be enough to make people think twice before they say what's on their minds.
Yeah, there is certainly a chilling effect, but by the same token, I think the British police are very cheery of that now after a case in which the judge was bitterly critical of the police.
Yeah,
I mean, it should never have happened at all, of course.
No, it shouldn't have.
And
but I think the word would have gone out through the police forces of the United Kingdom. You'd be very, very sure that you're dealing with something that actually matters before you do this, because the judiciary's been alerted to this now, and you know, if we'll end up in front of a judge and we'll end up getting a backlashing just like that guy up north did. So, yeah.
But I mean, the current proposals, well, I mean, I don't think they're formal proposals, but they've been leaked from the cabinet. I mean, they do go quite far. 3 years, as you say, or you know, a term not exceeding 3 years is quite a stiff penalty. On the Kiwi blog, there's a list of things that you can do in New Zealand that get you a lesser penalty, and they include things like supplying explosives, and I think kidnapping children as well gets you less than 3 years.
Yeah, I think David Seymour was the first one to sort of list some of the crimes for which the maximum sentence was less than 3 years, including male-on-female violence. All sorts of quite serious from most people's perspective violations of human rights, individual well-being. It's extraordinary, and they will pay a price for it. And I'm always at a loss to understand why it is that this government in particular seems to lack a working set of alarm bells, politically speaking. Because you're handing your opponents a gift. A great big cudgel with which to beat you for the next 2 years or however long it's going to be.
I remember Martin Bradbury making that point shortly before Ardern and her government were unequivocally saved by the COVID crisis. That hate speech laws would fairly much doom them. But here we are. And to return to that question of what's happened on the left, tell me what you think about this. It seems to me that one of the other things that's happened on the left over the last, 2 decades or so is that large sections of the left have more or less abandoned working class concerns, which seem to me to be the root of the left, in favour of other forms of identity politics, whether it's sexuality or race or now the trans issue and so on, seems to have trumped everything. And you don't really hear any mention of social class amongst the constellation of things that people might be oppressed over. And that seems to have been contemporaneous with this rising censorious instinct. I'm not sure if they're connected in any way, or what are your reflections on that?
Oh, there's no disputing that the new social movements of the 1960s and 70s have emerged from the events of the last 30 or 40 years as most people's measure of what is left-wing. These all grew out of a traditional left-wing milieu. And it's always important to remember that if you look at civil rights and activism on behalf of African Americans. The Communist Party of the USA was always in the forefront of battles against lynchings. The famous Scottsboro Boys. The Communist Party was part and parcel of their defence back in the 1930s. So the traditional left has always associated itself with the principles of equality. I mean,
of course,
the French Revolutionary slogan, liberty, equality, fraternity. I mean, it goes back a long way. But the new social movements were always, I believe, a reaction to the old left, principally because the old left, the working class left, if you like, manifested many of the evils it theoretically opposed. So you had the United States labor movement. Large parts of it operated an exclusionary policy in relation to African Americans. In the civil rights movement, even among its black leaders, there was astonishing levels of sexism. I mean, Stokely Carmichael was asked by a journalist what position he thought women played in the black civil rights movement, and he answered crone. So if you were a woman in the civil rights movement, or if you were an African American in the labor movement, your attitudes towards the sort of overriding ideology, you could be forgiven for having a certain degree of skepticism or cynicism, because you would say, well, you say this, but you do that. So if you look at the history of the feminist movement, the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement, because homophobia was even more deeply entrenched across the left. So you can see that in many ways they were built in reaction to, not just to the discrimination at large in the wider society, but also in many ways they were a reaction to the discrimination that worked within the left itself, which is why you got such bitter struggles on the left, at least in the Western countries, back in the late 70s, early 80s. In many ways, what's happening now, the struggle against woke liberalism and all the rest of it, was anticipated 30 years ago. I mean, I remember going through precisely the same sorts of battles on the left of New Zealand politics in the 2 or 3 years immediately following the Springbok tour.
Right.
When, all sorts of organizations were torn to pieces by, what we now call identity politics. I mean, Corso was a hugely successful aid organization until the identity political activists took it over, whereupon it crashed and burned in very short order. Far left political organizations like the Workers' Communist League tore themselves to pieces over gender, race, and class disputes. So in many ways, this has already happened. It is now happening in the broader society. It was a very interesting period, and I don't know the mechanics of it in other countries, but certainly in New Zealand, a lot of people fled from the more traditional left-wing battlegrounds into the Labour Party, which was a huge party in 81, 82, 83, 84. 100,000 members, at least, not even counting the trade union affiliate. So a true mass party. And a lot of people came there as sort of refugees from the awful battles that were embroiling, points further to the left than the Labour Party. But what happened with Rogernomics was very, very interesting, because the Rogernomes made common cause with the Identarians, and they had to. Otherwise, they would never have had the numbers.
Right.
Their numbers were always agonizingly small from their perspective. But you take, for example, the contest between Ruth Dyson and Jim Anderson for the presidency of the Labour Party in 1988. Well, Jim only just lost, but he only just lost because the people who were strong supporters of Rogernomics made common cause with the Women's Council, Maori Council, and a whole lot of others in that sort of new social movements area, because those movements were in no way a threat to the neoliberal policies of Roger Douglas. Quite the reverse, in fact. Whereas the old left, the trade union left, the socialist left, were sworn enemies of what Roger Douglas and Richard Preble and the others were trying to do.
Right. Yeah.
And so there was a kind of alliance of convenience between those two groups, and in a way that has persisted, and you can see it reflected now across the whole of society, which suggests to me that it wasn't just a specific political alliance of convenience within the Labour Party at a certain historical juncture, but that it may actually be a more natural alliance across all Western capitalist states, because capitalism really doesn't care whether you're a female or whether your skin is black or white or whether you're gay or straight. The bigger the market, the better. The more participants in the consumer society, the better. It makes no sense to capitalism to exclude people from the marketplace or make them smaller consumers than they would otherwise be. So you get all kinds of positive statements coming out now from corporates, almost a contest now to see which big corporation is the wokest, because it in no way threatens capitalism. Identity politics does not threaten capitalism in any way, shape, or form, whereas the old traditional style of leftism most emphatically does.
So I know that the woke nowadays, they like to present themselves as just continuing on the victories of the civil rights movement and the women's movement and going back to the 60s and 70s and gay liberation. Is this the right analogy, though, or is this actually the case? Because, if you go back to the civil rights in the States in the 50s and 60s, and even much more recently, gay liberation, which has been a pretty recent thing, especially if you're thinking of the right to marry. I mean, all those things I think were great. I mean, I'm some kind of a Whig as well. Michael and I both think these things were great. It's probably pretty hard nowadays to find anybody who doesn't think those things were an example of progress across the political spectrum. What I'm less sure about is that some of the contemporary woke concerns are really continuing the same liberatory movement in the way that they claim. What do you think about that?
Well, a friend of mine, Matt McCartan, who's been in the trade unions and on the left all his life, he summed it up nicely for me when he told me about an encounter he had with a younger group of activists. He said to them, look, think about this. If you had a group of left-wing people from right across, all of the issues, and you said, hands up those who are in favor of racism, hands up those who are in favor of sexism, hands up those who are in favour of homophobia. How many hands do you think would go up? He said, this is what he finds, what I find, what many people find so difficult to cope with, because it's not as if there is a vocal faction of the left openly calling for racist policies or sexist policies or any of the other isms. And yet there is still this hostility. What on earth are we fighting about precisely? Now, I'm sure you will get any number of voices raised saying, well, there is still a huge amount of discrimination against gays. There is still a huge amount of discrimination against trans people. There's still a huge amount of discrimination against Maori and Pacifica and immigrants and so on and so forth. And all we are saying, to coin a phrase, is give equality a chance. And
yeah, I'm not sure that is all they're saying, though. I mean, to go back to that French revolutionary phrase, liberty, equality and fraternity, it seems to me that what we're starting to lose is the fraternity part. And we've talked about that before on this podcast as well, that actually what a result of all of this is a fraction, a sort of fracturing of people, or an atomization of people into different identity groups who are to differing extents held up as ipso facto victims or ipso facto perpetrators, depending on their characteristics. And so it's a move away from the Martin Luther King principle of, the accountability of the individual or individual people for their views and their attitudes and their treatment of others, towards a collective one based on all of these protected categories, which seems to me an absolute break with the past of the left, which, despite all of that infighting and so on, did at least have a semblance of the idea of a kind of universal fraternity, right?
Yes. Although I'm sure there will be those who say that we need to find another term.
Sure.
I mean, because it's an undeniable fact that most of the French revolutionaries were absolutely shocking and misogynist.
No doubt.
Solidarity is my preferred term.
Let's go for that.
Is what they meant. And you're right. There does seem to be a kind of elevation of the concept of victim, which runs through, I think, many of these new social movements. And the most striking thing about that is that the qualities that they make the focus of their analysis are all qualities over which human beings have absolutely no control.
Right.
You cannot choose to be white or black. You cannot choose to be gay or straight. You cannot choose to be man or woman, although that would certainly be disputed. May now be subject to a certain degree of dispute. But the difference between, I think, the past and the present is that the leftism of the past was all about saying we can change things. We don't have to accept the position in which we find ourselves. The last lines of the Communist Manifesto, workers of the world, unite. You have nothing but to lose but your change. You have a world to win. Well, that is a statement of agency.
Yeah.
A statement of being able to change the world. You have a world to win. But you can't say that if everything is about being black, or everything is about being a woman, or everything is about being gay. You can't say the same thing. You can't assign the same agency all you can do is say, and because you're black, these are the things that happen to you, and therefore these are the things we have to address. I mean, imagine the hot water that Martin Luther King would have gotten himself into today.
That's right.
For his famous, I dream of a day when my 4 little children will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
And
that's always been my lodestar when it comes to racial equality
and any other kind of equality, right? Because that's what we're trying to drive towards, is a situation where human beings are human beings, irrespective of those immutable characteristics. And yet it seems that what has taken hold is this unbearable fatalism whereby you're condemned to oppression by dint of these characteristics, or to be a perpetrator, as it may be. And
that's right. Yes, you're either a victim or you are a person of unwarranted privilege. You are either prey or you are a predator. There's really nothing in between.
And all 3 parties to this conversation are terrible perpetrators, aren't we? Because of all of our categories.
Yes. Well, the worst kind of predators, articulate and well-educated predators.
And dreadfully white and male and straight and all of that. Yeah.
It is kind of interesting how that seems to work, though, because, I mean, of course, sometimes there are genuine victims and perpetrators, but, I mean, the moment it seems like a completely innocent act to say that you've suffered oppression. But, of course, there aren't really victims of oppression without oppressors. So you immediately start to generate oppressors around you. And it's sort of, it's quite easy to say that you've been oppressed without saying who's oppressed you, but just sort of implying it. And you don't have to back it up. And then so it immediately sort of cleaves society into these 2 categories.
Well, you do, but you see, the great argument why identity politics hasn't dwindled is because women are subject to the most brutal oppression. Gays and trans are beaten up in the streets. We all watched Officer Chauvin crush the life out of George Floyd. I mean, they've got reality on their side in this. The question isn't, are blacks oppressed, are women oppressed, are gays and trans oppressed? The question is, how do we respond to that oppression? What do we do about it? What is the best way out of this?
Well, also,
that's where the argument lies.
We might also ask, by way of addressing that question, what have we been doing for the last half century? And by any measure, while certainly acknowledging your point that the fight is not over, that things have got an awful lot better. I mean, I remember very well the homosexual law reform movement in New Zealand, and I've told this anecdote before.
The 800,000 signatures collected against the bill.
Yeah, yes, that's right. And walking down Lambton Quay in support of the bill in a demonstration with my gay piano teacher and his partner, and having bottles thrown at us. So, I mean, things have come an awful long way since then. And one might surmise that if we left our hate speech laws and our civil society as it is, then things would continue to move in that positive direction.
It's also fair to say that
maybe I'm just being a wig again. But
I fear your wiggishness is baked in.
I'm afraid so.
It's also important. I mean, there's some things that get left out of the conversation as well. I mean, I think that it's true in the UK at least that considerably more men get murdered than women in a given year. And in terms of various other statistics, I mean, workplace fatalities and so on. More men die.
I was intrigued also by the decision, whether it was the government or the upper echelons of our armed services, to dedicate this Anzac Day to the women who served. The historian in me I'd like to see some data on that. How many women killed in action World Wars?
Yeah, it's interesting. I heard on the radio someone was saying we have to remember the women who stayed at home too, who were I think he's put it something like who were doing all the real work. And I thought, well, okay. I mean, of course they were doing a lot of work, and that work wasn't always acknowledged in history.
Rosie the
but
Riveter and all that. All she had to worry about were rivet guns.
would you prefer to be at home or in the trench in World War I? That's the real question.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. However, people's historical sense is ill-developed.
To say the very least.
I'm not sure that our new compulsory New Zealand history curriculum is going to improve that to any great degree. But anyway,
we might wonder that. But we're sort of coming up to an hour here, and so perhaps by way of a concluding question and something that will hopefully bring in your well-developed sense of history, I'm interested to ask you about what you think about the idea of the left-right spectrum and whether it might be becoming redundant or need at least to be revised in terms of some different dimensions. And if we think about the conversation that we've had and the extent to which we might, I'm not sure if we agree, but that there has been a break with the past in terms of a universal solidarity principle giving way to a much more atomized view of identity and these different groups. Do you think that the old left-right spectrum will stand the test of time, or do we need to start to think about our political landscape in a different way?
Well, taking the broadest possible perspective, the world proletariat is now well and truly relocated in Asia and to a lesser extent in South America and Africa. Whereas the world proletariat used to be concentrated in Europe and North America. What that has meant is that the battle between labour and capital will take place somewhere else, I suspect. And the working class, such as it is that remains, is a thoroughly degraded and marginalised social formation and prey to all the temptations of degraded and marginalised social formations, as Donald Trump so powerfully demonstrated. So in terms of the politics of the West, and in particular the politics of New Zealand, there is very little of the activity that characterised capital versus labour in this particular part of the world. When I think back to the days of the FOL, to the famous reaction to the mill wage order of 1968, to the general strike called in 1979, the amazing reaction when Bill Anderson was arrested for contempt of court and 10,000 unionists marched up Queen Street to demand his release. I mean, those days are gone. The percentage of workers in the private sector workforce who are members of trade unions is now below 7%, whereas in 1983 it was 45 to 50%. The Labour Party is no longer a working class party. It is a social liberal party with a lot of Pacifica and Maori support. What's left of our working class, as Matt McCartan put it, blue collar, yes, but surrounding a brown neck, not a white one, which complicates matters, as we will no doubt see in the months ahead. So the left-right struggle is still there, but in the classic form, the recognizable form, which was, so obvious when you had big union marches down Lambton Quay or up Queen Street, with all of the union banners and the red flags flying. That's all gone. What's left is this discourse about equality and identity, and that has always been a part of the left-wing struggle, but in New Zealand at least, that's pretty much all that's left. And those forces are running headlong into the deeply ingrained social conservatism of a former colony, a settler state, with all that implies. And that generates heat, and that makes the participants in those particular movements feel that they are engaged in a real struggle. And in many ways, they are, because those oppressions are still extant. They are still claiming victims. But if you look at the overarching structures of society, they are still capitalist. They are still individualist rather than collective. They are still, if you'll pardon my presumption, Michael Whiggish. And the identity movement may shake them, but they will not stir them. They will not cause those institutions to crumble.
Well, I guess
the only thing that will ever do that is if working people take control of the means of production, distribution, and exchange, and that is not going to happen anytime soon.
No, well, the next few years will be interesting nonetheless, and perhaps in the sense of the Chinese curse about living in interesting times.
Living in interesting times.
Indeed.
Yes,
but
yes, indeed.
Look, thank you so much for this conversation, Chris. It's been really interesting, and I've always enjoyed your sense of history very much in your writing, and it's come through today, and it's been very enlightening and challenging conversation for me, and we have all too few people from the left to talk to, really, because there aren't enough of you who really seem to want to champion free speech.
We're an absolutely dying breed, I'm afraid, quite literally. Only last year, in the midst of COVID, we lost Dean Parker, who was a wonderful playwright and had an encyclopedic knowledge of the New Zealand left. His death was a great loss in every sense, culturally and politically, historically, intellectually. There aren't many, and the reason I am such a fervent upholder of the freedom of expression is because without it, these memories, these ideas are all too easily extinguished, and to me that would be the real tragedy.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, and we'll hope to see you around again sometime.
Well, I'm always happy to talk.
Thanks a lot.
As my wife says, the problem isn't getting Chris to talk. The problem is getting him to shut up.
Well, that, as we've said to many others on this podcast, is a good thing as far as we're concerned. So thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Okay.